We're plunged into a conversation that seems to be a conversation that just about every place in this country needs to be having. It has to do with this foundational matter of race and what it has done to us as a community and how we can respond to the damage that's been done going on. Although some can argue that because we have an African-American president that we've entered a post-racial time in America, it doesn't take much looking around to see that is just not the case. We do look around, and what do we see? The deaths of unarmed African Americans, Michael Brown, Sarah Bland, members of the Bible study at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We hear of the defacing of countless Black Lives Matter signs across the country. And we know that we still have a great deal of work to do to confront racism in our nation, in our city, in our church, and in ourselves. And so more than ever, the issues of race and racism are on our minds and on our tongues, sometimes in ways that are hurtfully divisive, but also sometimes we find that we can step beyond the stereotypes, beyond the barriers between us, and have some real, positive, creative, helpful listening and learning from one another. We each have our own personal work to do in this regard, as we each have profound work to do in helping the systems of which we are a part, the organizations, the schools, the churches of which we are part, to move into claiming this as a centerpiece of the agenda. To stimulate our thinking and help us set some guideposts on this journey, it's going to be a pleasure and a privilege in a few moments to welcome to us Jim Wallis, who has been making a powerful witness to God's desire for justice for a long, long time. He'll be speaking tonight about his newest book, America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America. His vast experience with many leaders in the struggle, especially with leaders of faith communities, makes him the ideal person for us to be hearing from at this point in time. As you probably all know, Jim is a best-selling author, a public theologian, a speaker across the nation, an advisor at times to presidents, an international commentator on ethics and public life, president and founder of Sojourners, the community and its magazine, a magazine that has a combined electronic and media distribution of 250,000 people. He's taught at Harvard University and at Georgetown and a variety of other institutions. Jim lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Joy Carroll, one of the first women to be ordained in the Church of England, and author of the book Beneath the Cassock, The Real Life of the Vicar of Dibley. He is married to the Vicar of Dibley. That's probably an inside noting for those who follow public television, as some of us do. Let me give you a roadmap for the evening. In just a moment, my colleague Bill Rich will share some brief words about the Christ Lecture Series, which tonight is one part. This is one part of it. Then Jim will speak to us, and his remarks will have a response from Janice Pryor, a Trinity parishioner and one of the leaders in Trinity's anti-racism work. Then we'll have a time for one-on-one conversations amongst you in the pews, time to share some thoughts about what you're hearing, and then to formulate some questions and thoughts to which the speaker can respond. We'll ask you to write those down, we'll collect them, and then we'll have our conversation. Thank you again for being here, and thank you for being part of this critical conversation. I hope all of us tonight can learn, can take some new insights in, and can step forward with the calling to address this great scourge on America's life and America's soul. Let me turn this over now to Bill Rich.
Along with Sam, let me say welcome to each of you who's here tonight, whether you're a parishioner or whether this is your first time here. We're delighted that you're here. A little bit of history. If you look to your right, along under the balcony, you'll see a red plaque. It commemorates William Price, in whose memory these lectures are given. William Price was a vestry member and a member of this parish back in the 18th century. And if you've ever thought that your generosity never matters and doesn't get passed down from generation to generation, his generosity is still funding these lectures. This is a kind of passing it forward that you may not have imagined. His will says that these lectures are to be free and open to the public, and that there's to be a free will offering that is not to come to Trinity Church. The free will offering is to go to one of two other churches in the city, King's Chapel, which at the time of William Price's life was still an Anglican Episcopal church, but is now the first Unitarian church in this city. And then Old North Church, an Episcopal church in the North End, made famous by the famous lanterns in the steeple to announce the coming of the Redcoats. So if you'd like to be generous and pass on Mr. Price's generosity, there's a plate there in the back that you can do so at the end of tonight. Mr. Wallis has also graciously agreed to sign copies of his book. So after the lecture, through stairways just inside the main doors off of Copper Square, you can get downstairs, purchase a copy of the book, or perhaps you've already brought one with you, and he'll be signing copies there right after the lecture. So I hope you'll now join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Jim Wallis.
Thank you, Sam. Can you hear me in the back? You hear?
Yes.
Good. Thumbs up. Thank you, Sam and Phil, and anxious to hear from Jens Pryor and all of you. It's good to see you. It's good to see you tonight. In one of our meetings in Chicago, a young hip-hop pastor opened in prayer, and he said, keep your eyes open, look around, see who's here. This is all about seeing each other. So I thought I wanted to say how glad I am to see you. My wife, Joy Carroll, is known as the Real Victor Dibley in the UK. There's a comedy series there about a woman who went to a parish. Her name was Jerry. They expected a boy, and it was Geraldine. It's a great British comedic hit, and Joy was the script consultant for the show, and she just called me before I came, and she asked me where I'd be tonight, and I told her, she said, oh good, the Episcopalians will take care of you properly. Thought I would start with a story about Joy tonight. We met at Greenbelt, this big festival in the UK, music festival. Bono was there at the beginning, about 25,000 British young people. I would go there to speak, and one year she was also speaking. We met, we got married, and went back there, and this time brought our son Luke, who was 4 years old. So Joy's up on the stage celebrating the Eucharist for 25,000 British young people. And here's my 4-year-old boy sitting in my lap watching his mother. And she's talking to them, the Lord be with you, and they're saying, and also with you, and they're doing whatever she tells them to do. He's looking around at her, and then he looks at me and says, Dad, can men do that too? And I've often noted, I did this morning at breakfast, how women are changing the narrative in many of our churches. Someone says to my sons, Luke or Jack, what women can or can't do, and they'd be astonished at the things that people think. So this is also one of those narrative-changing questions, because our narrative has been all wrong for a long time. So we're going to try and look at that tonight. I'm really pleased to be back. I've been here before. I'm glad to be here because I believe, I know Sam agrees with this, that pulpits and congregations are intended to change their communities and change their nations and change their worlds. Sam was at National Cathedral after being here, and I was back. I'm going there again in a few weeks to do the forum and do this sermon on Sunday morning. I was in Grace Cathedral just two weeks ago. But after I went to preach at the Glide Church in San Francisco, which is a different kind of church. It's a church for marginal people and those who want to be with them. And it's quite a scene every Sunday morning. And we were next to this woman named Olivia, and sitting next to her before I was up to preach, and she literally didn't have any hands. She just had stumps and no feet. And there she was, clapping her stumps together, worshiping and celebrating the Lord. It was one of the most worshipful moments for me on this whole trip, going to Ebenezer Baptist next month. In Ferguson, we went to two small churches with pastors, Tracy Blackman and Starsky Wilson, who've gone in the streets with the young kids in Ferguson. First ones, clergy to go into those streets. Trinity Church in Chicago, south side, where Moses Moss III is preaching. I think pulpits like this really can change things like we're talking about tonight. We often don't believe that. But pulpits and congregations can and are supposed to change their nations and the world. So I'm glad to be here. This was a day of being a holy place for me. I began at breakfast here with the vestry and the foundation board, then had an inside tour of Fenway Park. Speaking of holy places, I did the Fenway Writers Series last night and got this inside tour of the park today, and that's for my two boys when I told them to leave Boston. I decided where I'd go and Harvard and all that, but Fenway was the thing that most impressed them. We're a baseball family, and this morning I was struck by three respondents to our conversation from this church, and very moved by what they had to say, because for them, everything about this issue was personal, because the issue had become proximate. Proximity became the issue, all three of them, and they spoke movingly about it. So I'm a Little League baseball coach for 22 seasons, now 11 years, and it gets proximate. So all of my black players that I ever coached, every one of them, whether it's low-income family or sons and daughters of the top lawyers in Washington, D.C., everyone has had the talk with their mom and dad. How to behave, not to behave in the presence of a police officer with a gun. What to do and not to do. Every kid has had the talk. None of my white players ever had that talk. And almost none of their parents know what's going on. Though they call each other friends and talk sports and restaurants and baseball and even politics. And how proximate we get to all this is really the heart of the question. My experience is when Christians get proximate to this question, it changes us. But 75% of white Americans have not one significant relationship with African Americans in their social circle. 75%. So I wasn't surprised when, after the book came out, the survey concluded that 62% of white evangelicals and white Catholics and white mainline Protestants believe that the shootings of young African Americans were, quote, isolated incidents. When 80% of black Protestants, black Christians, thought they were, quote, part of a pattern in their own lives. Brian Stevenson, who I regard as the nation's premier lawyer in mass incarceration, death penalty, he wrote the foreword of the book, and in the foreword he talks about his experience going home one night in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was working then. He's in Montgomery now. And he just pulled up to his house, his own house. Legal briefs all over the seat, long night at work ahead, tired, been a long day, long week. And he just was listening to some music, and he just wanted to finish listening to Sly and the Family Stone. Just put his head back in the headrest of his car just to listen. But before long, he got startled by a bang on his window and looked up, and here was a police officer with a gun pointing at his head, saying, "Get out of the effing car, or I'll blow your effing head off." And he got out, he's a lawyer, he's smart, hands up, "Nothing here, my house, it's okay, it's all cool." But he got spread eagle in the car, and embarrassing him from his neighbors. After a long time, the cop figured out he was dealing with a Harvard lawyer or a Supreme Court lawyer. Did he say, "I'm sorry, sir"? No, he said, "You're lucky this time." Now, we could do some hands around the room, and I could tell you who could tell you stories like that of their family and their kids and their friends, their ministers. Do we even hear each other's stories? Do we listen? Do we believe them? Do they change us? Racial geography. Someone told me yesterday morning that Boston is the third most segregated town in America. Chicago told me there are 2. Racial geography isn't accidental. Racialized ghettos are done by policy. By policy. And we are structured apart from each other, and so we don't listen and pay attention. So after Trayvon Martin was shot and killed, the conversations in black churches were entirely different that weekend than in most white churches. Or families after Michael Brown was shot and killed. How does this get proximate? That word is what Brian uses all the time. Proximate, he said. Proximity is how we start. How do we get proximate? So the book is saying that we have to go deeper than we've gone. We've had 250 years of slavery, 100 years of legal discrimination and segregation and terrorist violence against black bodies and lives, 50 years of a civil rights movement, 7 years of a black president. And we haven't been cleansed by our politics. So let's go deeper and talk about what I want to suggest as America's original sin. It's deeper language and requires a deeper response. And I don't just mean slavery. That's kind of easy for those of us that, I love Ta-Nehisi Coates' line, those Americans who think they're white. I love that. Many of us in this room are part of that group. And we want to say, well, my grandparents didn't have slaves. I didn't have slaves. My people came after all that. It's in the past. But a black teenage boy in Ferguson said to me in the last 6 months, I still feel like I'm treated like 3/5 of a person. That was when we wrote the Constitution. Because, and this is a Christian church, and we're Christians, at least some of us are, I am, But this happened because of the Christians who realized there was a contradiction between our faith and what we were about to do to kidnap African slaves. And what we had done to indigenous people. Took their lives and their land, and now we kidnap another people to build the most powerful economic resource for a new nation, slavery. But only a few said, because my faith is a contradiction to that, we won't do it. A few Quakers decided that. But most of us Christians said, okay, therefore, we will say these slaves, these Africans, are not fully human. That's what we said. So at the beginning of our nation, our founding principle was, not all men are created equal, whatever that meant to them. And we're now on the way to a more perfect union. We said officially, black lives matter less than white lives. Indigenous lives matter less, and other lives who would come of color would matter less than white lives. We said that as a founding principle of our nation. And the original sin lingers on. So repentance from that in our Christian tradition, and imams in this trip have told me, and rabbis too, that in their traditions, it doesn't mean just feeling sorry, hanging your head, and being sad for the past. It means turning. That's what repentance means. Turning around, going in a new direction. What does it mean? What's that roadmap of repentance from our original sins? So the subtitle is Racism, White Privilege and the Bridge to a New America. So it was the decision to create this social construct called race. I used to do anti-racism training with a lot of Americans who think they're white, and I noticed how we white folks don't much commit to our European ethnicities. It's kind of hard for us to do. So I get them going about, go Irish and all that, and finally they get into it, and then I'd say, I could never tell you Irish from you Germans. You're exactly alike. And they all laugh. Or you Italians from the Swedes, you have the same personality. And they all laugh. You must be the same because when you got to America, you all became white people. It's this normality of whiteness, this entitlement of whiteness, this rightness of whiteness, this expectation of whiteness. I was at Trinity Episcopal Church just on Sunday, this past Sunday, and I gave a talk, and I had 4 respondents who were all women. One was African American, one was Latino, one was Native, and one was Asian American, and they're all talking about their theologies. African American and Latino, and I just make the point that all of their theologies are perceived by us as a certain kind of theology, kind of extracurricular, kind of outside the mainstream. The mainstream of theology is white, Western, individualized, but their theologies were marginal, new, different theologies. And the thing, they're powerful all for them. The thing I noticed though, they all seem weary of trying to raise the theology that comes out of their own tradition. James Coney in the seminary says repentance for white people means, it's a powerful phrase, it means dying to whiteness. It's a chapter of the book called Dying to Whiteness. Because I want to suggest that too many of us as white folks still see racism as a problem that other people have, that minorities have, which leads to problems that we want to be helpful to. Be helpful. We don't see this as about us and our false identity. There's no such thing as white people. We created them. There's European ethnicities, but this thing we created to justify slavery. And that was the original sin, which lingers on in our policing systems, our criminal justice system, our housing patterns, which I've learned in every city we've gone to, our gentrification, our economics. You know, another Ferguson kid said to me, "I'm a protester." I was asked, "What do you protesters want?" He said, "I want an education. I want a job. I want a family. My son Luke's going to college next year. He's looking at some schools around here. He's made his choice going somewhere else, but he wants an education, a job, and a family." Proximity, what does that mean? I decided to write this book after Trayvon Martin was shot and killed. And what struck me so clearly again was how Luke, my son, 6 foot tall, varsity athlete being recruited by college baseball coaches, if my big son had been in Sanford, Florida, that same night as Trayvon Martin was, doing the same things, in the same places, even wearing a hoodie, everyone knows that he'd have come back to me in joy. Everyone knows that. Trayvon didn't come back to his parents, and he isn't going to college next year. We went to Britain over the holidays, my wife being a Brit, to see our family there, and my son Jack, who's 12 years old, was telling all his family that he's 5'7.5" now. That half's very important when you're 12 years old. And they said, "Jack, you look so strong and athletic and impressive." No one said, "Jack, you look threatening." While we were there, the news came across the pond that the Cleveland police officer who shot Tamir Rice, 12-year-old, would not face a trial, indictment, or any accountability for what he had done. And I'm sitting on a London couch with my son Jack, and I'm reading the words of the prosecutor from Ohio, who said, "But he was a larger than average 12-year-old. He was 5'7.5", just like my son Jack. Now I know that park in Cleveland, I don't really think that if Jack Wallis had been there, even holding on to a toy gun, by the way, you can conceal and carry guns in Cleveland, that a police officer would have driven up and in 2 seconds shot him without talking to him. What does it mean to be proximate? This issue is systemic, and the book talks about that. We should talk about that tonight. We've turned a book tour into a town meeting tour. Now in about 15 cities, and we have really good conversations. They're multiracial, intergenerational, and they're specific of what this means here, from San Diego to LA to San Francisco to Seattle and Portland and Atlanta and St. Louis and Twin Cities, Chicago. Philly is next, I think. And they've been great conversations when we get proximate to the people and the cities in which we live. So that's what we're trying to do, and questions come up like what is white privilege? I was sharing with Janice Stan in the back room. That came up in one of our elder rooms comes up, and this young African-American young man said, "Well, white privilege. If you don't see it, you got it. If you don't see it, you got it." I'm a white baby boomer. I was the beneficiary of the biggest affirmative action program in my nation's history. My dad was a World War II Navy veteran. He came back and they gave him and my family a GI Bill. Free education, and an FHA loan, which was the only way we could have our first house. Education, a house, you're middle class. My government made my white family middle class. The black GIs didn't get the same thing that my dad got. Jim Crow kept that from happening. And they couldn't get new houses, just some old things here and there. That's my generation, right? Affirmative action for me. Taking your kid to college, visiting all these places. I learned in places like Boston that legacy matters, right? Your parents, your grandparents have gone to school, it helps you. So we went to Harvard, and how many black or brown kids' parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have been to Harvard? Legacy matters. All kinds of ways that we as white folks just don't understand how, as one pastor put it in Seattle, he said, he's trying to relate to all this as a white pastor. So it's almost like being on a walking, like a walking stairway thing. The kid moves you around airports. You're on this thing, and even when you stand still, you keep moving forward. And you're progressive, so you're against all the bad stuff that's happening that you can see. I'm against this, against that, against that. But I'm still, without even walking, I'm moving forward. So he said, so when Jim says repentance is turning around, going your direction, it means turning around and walking against a moving stairway. Or running against a moving stairway. That's tough to figure that one out. However, it's clear to me that at St. Paul's AME Church, where we were last night, 400 people across the city were there, and this group tonight, there's no doubt in my mind that the audience last night and tonight has all kinds of people with influence who could change how that stairway works. There's no doubt in my mind that those two audiences, and the many people who weren't there last night or tonight, but care about all these things, could change things in Boston, and already are. So how do we move from the original sin, racism, white privilege, and build a bridge to a new America? What does that look like? Particularly when you see, as somebody put it this afternoon to me, when that white privilege is threatened, we are seeing the rage against the coming of the light. What's coming? Well, in 2 or 3 decades, we'll no longer be a white majority nation. For the first time, no longer a white majority nation. We'll be a majority of minorities. And a whole lot of older white folks are really fearful and resentment of that. And now they have a strong man who is filling the atmosphere with racial fear and hatred and polluting our environment even further. I'm from Detroit, and up the road in Flint, I know the book would be painfully well-timed, I don't know how and where, but Flint, where the parable there, the story is, racism is in the air we breathe and the water we drink. And the toxicity. So when people say, well, I'm not a racist, what a stupid thing to say. It's not about individualized responses, and it's also not about, it doesn't help. My friends who are people of color tell me it doesn't help us to have whites feeling shame and guilt. and then going home. Rather, it's about to benefit from oppression is to be responsible for changing it. I'm not guilty for everything that's ever been done to people of color that I have control of. No, I'm not, but I have benefited from all that. That means we are responsible for changing it. That's what I think building a bridge means. My son, Jack, I remember there's a whole chapter here on immigration reform, which many of us have been very involved in, Sojourners. And the most important talk I gave on immigration turned out to be my son Jack's 5th grade class. They were studying the topic, and they had 2 dads who were involved. One was an immigration lawyer, and I was doing with a fast with Eliseo Medina, immigrant leader, and we had a 31-day water fast, and right across the Capitol, right from the U.S. Capitol across the street. And so I went to talk to kids, and I told these kids about 11 million undocumented people that are in Boston too, who can't get medical care that they need or police protection, and whose families are being broken up because of 1,000 deportations every day, including under the Democratic Party. And these kids were just, their faces, they just were astonished. They said, "That's terrible. Why don't they just fix that? Why didn't the Congress just fix that? Have you talked to them?" I said, "Yeah, we've talked to them." What do they say? They say that their constituencies are afraid. What are they afraid of? And then it hit me. I looked at this John Eaton Public Elementary School in Washington, D.C. I looked at the kids. Half of them I coached on baseball teams. African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American in Washington, D.C. White, Somali, Maltese, everything. I looked at them and I said, "They're afraid of you. They're afraid of you." And the kid said, "Afraid of us? Why?" "Because you look like the America we're becoming. You look like the new America. You look like the kind of country that we're now emerging into. Why are they afraid of that?" And I said, "Well, they don't think it's going to work." "How's it working?" Kid said, "It's working great. It's really cool." So our job is to convince America that this is really cool. But at one of our meetings, someone said, maybe they're afraid that it might work. Maybe that's what they're afraid of. So this bridge to the new America, I did a piece today called Donald Trump, the death knell of white supremacy. This isn't going down fast or easy. Anger, resentment, and conflict and violence is standing in the way. And William Barber, who's leader of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, talks about it's not just the new Jim Crow, like Michelle Alexander talks about, how the mass incarceration of millions of young black men and women, and then when they come out of prison, they're disenfranchised from voting. She taught us how that's happening now. But Barbara said it's now James Crow Esquire. Suits and ties in back rooms with disenfranchising people incarcerated. The drug use, white and black, is exactly the same. The incarceration is massive. Then you disenfranchise, and then you gerrymander congressional districts, and you end up with the majority of this country was in favor of immigration reform a year and a half ago. We fought that battle, we won every demographic, including Republicans. We won even white evangelicals. If they had just voted, we'd have won. But in the Congress, 3 Catholic bishops and 3 of us evangelical leaders were promised by the Republican leadership they'd take a vote on a Senate bill that had already passed, and they lied to us. Because they had gerrymandered districts whose members of Congress blocked this from happening. There are no minorities in those districts, and they blocked it. A minority of people vetoed democracy when it came to immigration reform. Their plan is to obstruct, block, stand in the way of, deny, delay the new demographic that we're becoming from changing our country. James Crow Esquire is doing this along with Jim Crow. So this is going to be a matter of 2 things, I think. One, it needs a whole new set of relationships between the people who are going to make up the new America. Our relationships. Then it's going to take those relationships changing public spaces and public policies. So, the Galatians text that we all love to repeat and talk about, Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. We are all one in Christ Jesus. I learned in the research of this book that Galatians text was a baptismal text in the early church. It was a baptismal formula. So when baptism happens, when we make our faith public, here's these new converts coming to be baptized, and they always use that text. And they were saying, in effect, here are the 3 dividers of humanity: race, class, gender, Galatians 3. It's all there. And our new community, following after Jesus, we the body of Christ, what we're doing is undermining all that. Tearing down those barriers. We're putting those things aside because we're all one in Christ Jesus. So we raise this in Los Angeles, which has become already this new demographic. LA is becoming what we're all going to be. And we had a clergy breakfast, about 100 clergy, and they said, we're still in these bubbles and silos with the diversity all around us, but not everywhere. There was a church called New Song, where I got to preach, and it's all completely multicultural, multiracial, and the average age is 28 in that church. They feel like, and they're using the Good Samaritan text, Luke 10, as their church text, where a lawyer asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? Now what they didn't know was that lawyer in the text was a Washington lawyer. he was. And I know that tone of voice. It was not, Bill, who is my neighbor? It's just who is my neighbor. And Jesus said, well, there's this guy who beaten up and robbed side of the road. The religious leaders walked past him. But then someone stopped who was from a different ethnicity, a Samaritan, who stopped and helped this man. Time, energy, resources, risk. And that's what I mean by neighbor. Go and do that. Be like him. So this New Song Church says, so our neighbor are those who are different than us. We're building a church with neighbors who are different than us. So the book talks about it. It's very specific. Michael Emerson's great research about, until 1994, we didn't even have data on how many churches in America were multiracial. We didn't even keep data. So he and others did the work, and their criteria was 20% of a church has to be of a different race than the majority race for it to be multicultural, multiracial. And there were 6% of the churches who were multiracial. Dr. King said famously a long time ago, 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the nation's week. At 9 o'clock Monday morning when our kids go to school, at 6 o'clock at dinner, family dinner, because we're not crossing each other's thresholds, the thresholds of life. Well, now it's up to 13%. It's doubled in 20 years, 30 years. But what he says is that doesn't happen accidentally. Remember the racial geography? You must be very intentional. And he lays out a whole thing about how this is happening, where it's happening, and why. But this is something that I've seen we can do. We can do, but not without that intentionality. So, as I look around, just even politically, and I look for where is the leadership going to come from to navigate these waters toward this new America. Building the bridges. The cover of the book has this is Selma, Edmund Pettus Bridge. I got to be there for the 50th anniversary of the crossing of that bridge. Bloody Sunday, you might know that history. John Lewis, not Congressman John Lewis, beaten almost to death. And the original foot soldiers who were there that day 50 years ago came back, and they got walkers and wheelchairs, and they're still marching. And the president was there, and the first lady and the family, George and Laura Bush, were there, bless their hearts. And I was invited to walk up the bridge with the foot soldiers. We got to the top, and it was a very emotional moment. We're all in tears, hugging, hanging on each other. And I asked myself, what's the bridge we're going to cross? That my kids are going to cross. This was for voting rights, which are now being taken away. But what bridge are we to cross? I think this is the bridge to this new America, this new demographic. And I see now some multiracial truth-telling about race. I mean, everyone in the audience, Janice knows this, this has been a conversation in black churches forever. This is a new conversation. Nothing is new in black churches. But there's a whole new multiracial conversation, particularly intergenerational. Brittany Packnett was running Teach for America in St. Louis, and her children, her kids, her students would go on the streets every night. So she went out with them, faced rubber bullets and tear gas, became a Ferguson leader, and here's what she says to me. She says, Jim, we don't just need allies in the Black Lives Matter, we need accomplices. I like that much better. How can people like us, all of us, be accomplices in this new movement led by a new generation of activists? So I'll close with this. We took 50 faith leaders to Ferguson for a retreat with those young Ferguson leaders. Now, I want to say about those young leaders, if those kids hadn't been out every night on the streets, night after night, when they weren't safe, they weren't popular, they were at risk every night, there wouldn't have been a Ferguson Commission or a Department of Justice report or a Presidential Policing Commission that I talk about in the book. They were the ones who did the heavy lifting, and from which all this really has come. And so we had 50 leaders, and the ones who went were actually, the prophetic, progressive Christian leaders, pastors, who wanted to be with these kids. And yet what was transforming is these young people looked at them who said, we've been transformed by this retreat with you. What do we do? And the kids said, well, let's talk about a whole lot of stuff, but the main thing we want to ask you is, here was their question, what are you ready, willing to risk? What are you willing and ready to risk? That's finally the question. This morning in our breakfast, we had questions cards, which we're doing tonight, and almost every time, the last question is the same. The last question comes up almost every time, often from a young African American or Latino, Latina, and the question is, this has been a really good conversation. But what action is going to come from it? And can I be hopeful that things are going to change for me and for my children? Can I have hope? And that's where I think we can do as people of faith, because that is our particular job in movements, to be the ones who bring that power and promise of hope. And I said last night at St. Paul's, and I'll end with this tonight too, my mentor on this question of hope, who taught me my theology, was an Episcopalian named Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And he taught a lot of us that hope isn't a feeling. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Optimism is how things are looking today. Did you see that Republican debate last night? Things aren't looking good, right? It's not a matter of what's my sense of, how good things are. It isn't, he would say, it isn't a feeling or a personality type. Hope is not a feeling. Hope is a decision. It's a choice you make because of this thing that we call faith. Hebrews says, no, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And my best paraphrase of that is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. A lot of stuff in this book, evidence about how we move from, in policing, from being guardians, which Plato talked about. We need guardians, being warriors. Police should be warriors, should be guardians. How do you move from retributive justice to restorative justice? How do we change the school to prison pipeline? All of that is changing the evidence, and I think we are the ones who have to, as Desmond would say, you have to believe change is possible, and then bet your life on it. That's how history changes again and again and again. And I think the constituency that will help build that bridge to a new America is the people who call ourselves the body of Christ. And to do that isn't admirable to be multiracial, but admirable. It's just essential to who we are. It's a calling. Globally, there's no more multiracial, multicultural community in the world than this one called the body of Christ. What does it mean in America? To be the ones who help navigate these waters and build that bridge to a new America. That's what people like you and I and us can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. When Jim's assistant and I talked on the phone about the shape of tonight, the first thing I heard was, Jim wants there to be a respondent, and the respondent needs to be a person of color. He said, there's nothing more dangerous than white people talking about racism as if it's our conversation. And so I want to introduce to you a member of our parish, Janice Pryor. Janice has been a member of Trinity for almost 10 years and a member of our anti-racism team and part of its leadership since its inception. Janice wears a number of hats in the secular world. She's been professionally employed in politics and media for over 30 years, working for and with a number of national and local politicians. As a media professional, she served as an editorial journalist, television producer, documentary producer, and syndicated radio talk show host for 5 years. Now she has returned to her first loves, painting and writing. Janice is a native New Yorker, Southerner by upbringing, and New Englander by choice, with Native American, African American, and European bloodlines. Please welcome Janice Carter.
Can you hear me? Speak up. Speak up. Can you hear me now? All right. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity tonight. I wrote my remarks about 3 days ago, having no idea what Mr. Wallis would be saying. So this may be repetitive and amusing in these parts, but my first reaction to the publication of America's Original Sin was absolute joy. I was so glad to see a white person writing about race other than Tim Wise or Peggy McIntosh that I didn't know what to do. And I thought, this man has got to come to Trinity. Here you are. So I dutifully purchased your book, and the minute I sat down to read, my joy started to fade before I opened it. As a woman of color, with the bloodlines of 3 races in my family, I felt the silence and stillness of sadness take over, fearing that once again, here was someone of goodwill who would forget that America's original sin was and still is twofold. And it was best expressed to those of us on the anti-racism team here by the executive director of Crossroads, our anti-racism training organization, when she said, quote, "A country built on stolen land and slave labor is bound to have some difficulties." She's right. We tend to forget that over 11 million Native Americans were killed for their land, so this country could be built by slave labor from Africa. But I pushed aside my grief and opened the book. The first thing I read were all the endorsements, a lot of endorsements. I kept running across the words truth and truth-telling. The introduction has the subtitle of, "You will know the truth and the truth will set you free." Okay, I thought, whose truth? And what version of it will be written on these pages? I continued to read the endorsement and realized that there was like a verbal trinity that kept coming up, repeating the words truth, power, and God. I felt better. I felt much better when I read Brian Stevenson's foreword, and he said, quote, "Slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved." And I heard myself say, yes, because he also said, while the mainstream church has been largely silent or worse, our nation has rationalized racial injustice ever since we first ignored the claims and rights of Native people who were subjected to genocide and forced displacement. It then dawned on me that maybe I was about to read a book that I could respect. So I took a leap of faith, and on page 33, I was rewarded with the following sentence. "The United States of America was established as a white society founded upon the near genocide of another race and then the enslavement of yet another." And I sincerely thank you for that acknowledgement. We know that the optics of racism are changing in the 21st century, and this country is browning. We all know that. Boston is now majority-minority. When I first came to this city back in the 70s, there was a black feminist organization known as the Combahee River Collective. And they stated something to the effect that slavery of black people in this country shall always remain the standard against which other forms of oppression shall be measured. And that once justice is meted out for that crime, all other forms of oppression shall lift. So I read America's Original Sin with a black and red consciousness, and this is my response, and it's only my response, as a woman of color who's been quite fortunate and in many ways privileged throughout her life, but not so privileged or fortunate that I can forget that the first thing people see is my color, followed by a series of assumptions that require my life to be a constant battle against stereotypes, ignorance, and violence. Because the truth of the matter, there are only 2 races in America, white and not white. So for me, this book begins at chapter 5, Dying to Whiteness. That's where I found the heartbeat. Start there. Go buy the book and start there. Because people who look like me are too often made to feel that racism is our problem. It is your problem too. And the social construct of race that academics talk about is made perfectly clear in chapter 5. The evolution of the creation of race to white supremacy, to white privilege, to the violation of our faith and the role of pure greed is made crystal clear. And thankfully, there is a section titled, "I'm not a racist, am I?" I have a feeling that if we had been paying attention to these truths and the consequences of denial and lying, the madness on Capitol Hill for the past 8 years, and the real possibility of Donald Trump becoming the next president would not exist. I think we have to walk into this work with our eyes wide open, with the knowledge that this work is as much for white people as it is for all of us. To those of you who are white, please don't get lulled into a false sense of security thinking you're doing this for us. The quality of your life also depends on understanding the poison of racism and how it impacts you. Not me, but you. And I really believe this book will help you understand that. Mr. Wallis, your plea to more forthrightly address racism must be accompanied by a full acknowledgement of its complexity today. It is frightening and painful work for all of us. Friendships will be tested and relationships challenged. But unlike so many, we have the strength of our faith, the life of Christ, and the whispering of future generations to motivate us. Unlike the elder in the church of your youth who told you, "Son, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. And our faith is personal." But you said right on page 8 that racism is a faith issue. I don't think that's a subject for debate, but I am so glad you reminded us of that. You said, quote, "Racism is rooted in sin, or evil, as non-religious people might prefer, which goes deeper than politics, pointing fingers, partisan maneuvers, blaming or name-calling. There will be no superficial or merely political overcoming of our racial sins. That will take a spiritual and moral transformation as well. Sin must be named, exposed, and understood before it can be repented of." So before I close, I want to give you some examples of racial complexity that I've seen in my life. But first of all, as you know, it is not safe to be black, brown, yellow, or red in this country. So many black men have been killed during the past year or so that I can't keep track. Black women who've been killed haven't received the same kind of attention. I think Sandra Bland is the case we're most familiar with. You spent some time writing about the talk black parents give to their sons because their lives depend on it. But I didn't catch anything about the talk black daughters receive. The truth is, it's not just one talk. It's a series of talks that follow you throughout your growing up years. There are talks that have to do with respect, dignity, appearance, decency, and survival, long-term and short-term. For those of you wondering, what in the world am I talking about? There's a separate conversation for the daughters? Yeah. So heed the advice of this book. Start having the conversations and find out. And two very recent examples from my life. Several years ago, I built a house in central Massachusetts. It was a great house, and I liked it. And for years, I've been driving around and seeing stickers on the backs of cars that say transfer station. I had no idea what a transfer station was until I moved to a community where there's a garbage dump. It's a euphemism for garbage dump. So every Saturday morning, I would get up and go to the transfer station to get rid of my garbage. And one morning, I'm standing in line, And you know how you could feel somebody staring at you? I sort of turned around, and there was this really unpleasant and unfriendly looking white woman, and she glared at me and she said, "You live here?" I said, "Yep." "How long are you going to stay?" I said, "Don't know." I went to the post office another day, and this is the first time it came to my attention that in some parts of the world there are post offices that close for lunch. So I managed to get down there right before lunch, and I'm sitting there or standing there doing whatever it was I had to do, and you can hear the employees in the background, and then suddenly everything went dead silent. You know that expression, no noise in the forest? I thought, my God, what's happened? And I happened to look up, and a woman had walked in. I don't know what nationality she was. I do know her skin was brown. And she had gotten lost, and she simply came in for directions. They gave her the most explicit directions. If they could have driven her out, they would have. So that was another signal to me. The third thing that happened, one morning I noticed that there was garbage in my driveway. And it wasn't thrown, so you could blame it on crazy teenagers. It was very deliberately set across the width of my driveway. And this went on for some time. I thought, you know, you're too old to be fighting this. You need to get out of Dodge. And I did. I sold my house, and I lost $200,000 in the bargain, but I'm still alive, because that's what I had to think about. Did I want to stay here with so much hostility where my life would be in danger? And all I had to defend me were 2 Cocker Spaniels, so I sold the house. Racism is active and alive and well right now. It is not somebody else's problem. It doesn't belong to another time. It is right here, right now. I beg of you to heed the advice of this book and start having the conversations to find out what's going on. We're trying to do that here at Trinity. Share the stories. Every one of us has a story, and I know that race plays a role in every life in this room and this country. All of our stories are valuable. You need a way to start those conversations. Begin with this book. Did I say that? Begin with this book. Let it be a roadmap to healing and learning and truth and perhaps salvation. It is work for all of us, regardless of our color. For those of us who are not white, there are complexities to this madness that defy articulation without breaking down in tears. So don't think you're out there, if you're white, just doing this all by your onesies. No, this has got to be a collective effort. It will take massive patience and courage from God. Difficult work, but not. Thank you.
So we've been invited to a conversation, and there's no place like the present to begin that conversation. We're asking you to turn to someone in a pew next to you and have a brief conversation about a concrete, specific question. Because it would be easy to leave here tonight with a kind of global conversation about what others should do. So the concrete question for you is, what one specific thing can I do? What one specific thing can I do to help dismantle racism and move one step on the bridge to a new and different America. Not what can others do, what can I do? And at the same time, if you want a question to be brought forward, the way we're doing this tonight is for you to write on these cards that you picked up at the door. So you can converse, you can write a question. I'll be standing in the center aisle collecting these cards. So we're going to take about 8 minutes to try to have a quick conversation. All right? Thank you.
I want to say the sentence that Janice pulled out of the book, that our nation was founded by the near genocide of one people, one race, one people, and then the kidnapping of another race, that turned out to be the most controversial sentence I've ever written by the response. The response was interesting. It was like, either that's outrageous or it's courageous. It's neither. It just was a statement of historical fact. And the more that we've been having these conversations around the country, it struck me that this original sin has tainted us, has closed our minds and our hearts, so much that we just don't want to ever talk about it. So just talking about it openly and honestly, the way we're doing tonight, is really a step in the right direction. So thank you. Janice said, answer the one about Donald Trump first. And I didn't know it was an episcopalian. No, I'm just teasing. I'm teasing. He said the Presbyterian.
No way.
Don't hold that. Don't hold that against him. You can't hear? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Well, I want to just briefly start with that, then turn to Janice and Sam. There are two kinds of populism in the U.S. historically. One is Huey Long. It's the populism that takes people who feel marginalized and wants them to blame the other, blame other people for their. So, for example, you do have white working class people now whose wages have stagnated. They're working at Walmart. Their kids have been sent to wars that didn't work but killed and maimed their children. They feel cut off from Wall Street. And they're angry. And Donald Trump wants to turn them against immigrants. And a president, he began as a birther, Trump, by saying, there's nothing wrong with being a Kenyan Muslim. But I know Barack Obama, and he isn't a Kenyan Muslim. He's trying to say he's not one of us, right? He's somebody else. He's different than us. And people are afraid of losing their country, as they were. So, but after slavery, William Barber, in his new book, Third Reconstruction, you should read it, talks about how a fusion party of white mountaineer people who didn't have slaves joined with former slaves and elected a governor, 2 senators, and members of Congress. Right after slavery, you had this populist movement, which is why Jim Crow was set up to keep that from happening. So white militias came in with guns and literally ran elected officials out of office. So we have a history where low-income whites and former slaves worked together to change politics. So we have a history. I mean, Bob LaFolle of Wisconsin, Paul Wellstone, Bobby Kennedy was getting votes from white working class people, and when he was killed, some of those same voters went back to George Wallis. There was a crossover there. So how do we build that kind of inclusive populism again, as opposed to what Donald Trump is building? But it really is rage he's eliciting among an angry, resentful population. And I think it's, and I don't want to get partisan here, but I think the Republican Party has been running on a kind of a nuanced racism for a long time, and Trump is now not nuancing anything. So when you Southernize a party, when you try and take over the South after the Civil Rights Movement and become the white party, now there are Republicans who don't want that, who want an inclusive party, but they're losing the debate within their party. So now, though, these same GOP leaders have lost control of the grassroots. So in some sense, they helped create Donald Trump, and they've lost control now, and they're just panicking now because he might actually win.
That's right.
You want to comment on that?
Oh, yes. The thing that frightens me about Donald Trump is that he's made space for the haters to come out. And people underestimate the power of hate. When he first announced that he was going to run, I remember people saying, oh, no, he's just playing around with us. No, not so much. I bet you something's up here. And sure enough, we are now looking at the possibility that he might, in fact, get the Republican nomination. To answer the question about, what can you do about someone like a Donald Trump, I'm a great believer in calling things for what they are, and people have got to call him out. This nonsense that he alludes to, that he's not racist, he's not this, his actions speak louder than words. And we have to call things by their rightful names, just as we have to call racism by its rightful name. So, if you have an opportunity in a conversation with a friend, with colleagues, and somehow the conversation gets to the presidential race of Donald Trump, have some honest talk about what he represents and what he's stirring up, because it's real. And unless you've actually looked into the eyes of someone who hates you because they just can't stand your being, you won't believe it. But take my word for it, what he's drumming up is very dangerous.
So here's another one. Would reparations, did you hear the word? Reparations to Native Americans, African Americans, have a significant input on healing racial tensions. So Ta-Nehisi Coates raised this of Bernie Sanders, will be bipartisan here. And Bernie didn't handle it very well, the question. Now, I'm often asked, what do you think of reparations? Well, let's look to Isaiah chapter 58, where the prophet calls us to be repairers of the breach. Repairs the breach and the restorers of streets to dwell in. Now, when you have a breach like we're talking about tonight, you got to repair it. Don't just say, let's just be sorry about it, and let's all get along now. Let's move right to reconciliation, right? A lot of us white folks want to move right to reconciliation without repentance and without repairing the breach. Now, what that means, Ta-Nehisi says, I'm not sure what it means. Let's have a conversation. What does it mean to repair the breach? Education, economics, what does that mean? And so it's a conversation that a place like this, in fact, at Trinity Wall Street, they have a committee now, a commission of lay people on reparations, which is not what I expected at Trinity Wall Street. So this is the kind of place where you can have that kind of conversation. People with influence and lots of spaces. So don't be afraid of it. Just what does it mean to repair the breach, I think is a big question. I love this one. How can we best be praying for you? Without ceasing. Without ceasing. As a person of color, how can and I open my family and friends to the idea of white privilege.
Who wrote that? The idea of white privilege. It is so obvious to me that it is really hard to articulate how you wake up your family of color to white privilege, but you need to start thinking about what's different in your life from the lives of your white friends. Whether it's the economic situation, whether it's how you're regarded when you walk into a store, whether it's the assumptions that they make that you can't make. If you break it down, you know, the ABCs of daily life, start looking at it that way. And if you have friends who are white and may be willing to engage in a conversation about that, I would urge you to do that. But I urge you to do that with the caution that the white friends are going to be a little startled, if not flat out insulted. And I speak from personal knowledge. I'm a very close friend. We've known each other since college, and she's white. And I took the opportunity to rant and rave on Facebook, which I don't do often, regarding all the resistance that Barack Obama was meeting in Congress. And I basically said, you know, I don't agree with everything he's done, but before we can have that conversation, we need to really look at why he has been met with so much resistance and look at the issue of race and lack of respect that he has gotten since he's been in office. Well, my friend exploded. And what are you saying? And how can you say that? And I'm not a racist. So we had that painful conversation about the difference between personalizing it and the fact that it's been institutionalized. That conversation has been going on for 2 years now. So don't kid yourself. It's tough, but you know, this is part of what we got to go through. This isn't going to be healed easily. You can't solve or repair or heal injustice painlessly. It's just not going to happen.
Can I pick up on what you just said about the ABCs of daily life and how different that is for people, no matter what their economic strata is? In Atlanta, we had a great conversation in Atlanta about this. And so Atlanta PBS had me over for an interview with them. We got talking. They're doing a study, PBS Atlanta, about how the infant mortality rate among black people is so much higher than among white people. So they try to adjust that to differences in income, wealth, and education. And to their surprise, they found no difference. No difference. And what they discovered was there's this technology I'd never heard of where you can examine human hair and determine the level of stress in the body of that person by some way of examining their human hair. And so they were looking at black mothers and white mothers, and how black mothers, even if they're educated highly and wealthy, the stress is so much higher, which leads to higher infant mortality. Stress is walking into that store every day and being looked at in a way you wouldn't if you were even poor white, right?
Can I share a story?
Yeah, please.
About that? When I was growing up in New York City, Saturday ritual with my mother, and I was go shopping on Fifth Avenue, and you think, ooh. And I reached adolescence, and it got to be a little ridiculous. And I said to her, why are we doing this? Can't we do something else? And she said to me, no. She said, you have to understand, I'm going to make sure I buy you the same quality of clothing. You're going to have the same kind of cars, the same kind of jewelry as, quote, the rich white girls do. She said, because for you, that's your armor. So when you walk in a store, they will at least stop a minute and look at you and say, okay, well, at least she's not dressed like, quote, one of them. And I thought, geez, I got a lot of nice clothes out of it, but it was difficult. So, you know, and I got old enough to, quote, shop by myself, and you had to dress for it. And then I walked in the store, you know, waiting to be attacked in some way or followed or something. And it didn't really happen, but I did notice that they treated me a little differently. Like I was sort of odd. And one retailer actually said, well, you know, you don't look like the rest of them. And I thought, oh God. So shopping, which is usually such a joy for so many women, became a real burden and a stressful practice for me. And I ended up using all kinds of services in stores so I wouldn't have to go out on the floor and be exposed to that. So it doesn't stop because you might have a bigger checkbook.
The president met with the young Ferguson leaders in the Oval Office and some other young activists from the country. And then out of that meeting, he was going to announce his new policing commission. So I was one of the people in the other meeting about to happen. And we were waiting and waiting and waiting because this 15-minute meeting with the young activists went over an hour. And Brittany Packneck was in that meeting, so I heard what happened afterwards. He was just deeply moved by them telling their personal stories about what it meant to be African American in St. Louis and Ferguson. And then he came into this larger meeting, law enforcement people and faith leaders and others. And he shared two stories. I've known him for a long time. He shared two stories none of us had ever heard him say before. When he was a senator, he was in Chicago, I'd be outside restaurants, as the president said, outside restaurants, you know, waiting or about to go in, and people would come up and throw me their car keys. I remember I was going to a fundraiser for the Clintons, and I was in the big ballroom, and I was supposed to sit at the head table with the Clintons, so I had to walk across the room in front of all the, you know, with all the people, and somebody walked up to me and said, "Could I please get them a cup of tea?" Now, you know that, you know, whether you're president or not, if you're ever reading the stories, but it was the talk with the young kids about their stories that got him talking about his stories. And so when in Atlanta, a friend of mine was a respondent, and she said, years ago, my 12-year-old brother was having his kidney expanding, something was wrong, and we took him to the hospital, and they wouldn't take him because we're a black family. And they just dropped, this is in Georgia, rural Georgia, to another hospital a long way away, and my 12-year-old brother, his kidney burst and died in the car. And my father never recovered. And so people were saying, oh, gee, this was a long time ago, she's older now. But then last week, my son, she said, was out for a drive. He got stopped by a police officer. And he asked the police officer, what did I do? And the police officer said, nothing. But he searched him and searched his car, then said, well, I'm going to have to let you go this time. So now her son is creating an app for young African Americans that when you get stopped like that, you hit this and your location goes to 3 of your friends, 3 people. And you say, I'm okay now, but here's where I am, here's what's happened to me. If you don't hear from me in half an hour, check me out. This is an app that your son's creating for 2016. So, but this is part of it. You've got 75% of white Americans don't have those significant relationships. And this is where the church could play a part in creating a space in which stories are listened to and believed You know, I was Here and Now yesterday in Boston, and they were doing this Rodney King thing. And Simi Valley came just as a coincidence, the same show I was on. And I was on the Ferguson Commission, sent out there to figure out what happened. And in a church in Simi Valley, a white Methodist church, a black Methodist church, and a white church, both in Simi Valley, both Methodists, came together for the first time ever, right? And they're all affluent, Simi Valley, and Methodist, black and white. So this black mother says, I worry about my son, he's a Los Angeles Police Department officer, and he's taken off his uniform to go undercover, and I get scared. And a white mother hears the black mother and says, oh, I would feel the same way if that happened to my son. He was, because all those gangs. And the black mother said, well, it isn't the gangs you worry about, it's the white LAPD officers, and how they'll treat my black son now with his uniform on. And I saw this woman's face. She was incredulous. She had never imagined anything like that. And it was silence in the room, and we all wondered whether the white mother would believe the black mother. And bless her heart, she did. And when she did, the conversation went so much deeper. Where are there safe spaces to have those conversations in this country? There aren't very many. And the churches, I think, would be one of those safe places.
I think this is our good moment to stop.
I've got one last question I'd like to answer. What should I do if I'm a white middle-aged person?
What's your answer?
I don't know any white middle-aged people.
Read the book.
There's actually a downloadable free study guide for the book, videos and all the rest. Everybody who's a white middle-aged person has spaces where you have influence. Workplace, church, school, home, spaces where you have influence over what happens in that space. We can't be silent in our spaces any longer. You've got to speak and act and call out, as Janice said, call out and confront when we see this happening again and again. So, you know, none of us, you can't just say, well, I can't change the Congress, I can't. You have spaces, we all have spaces where we have influence over those spaces. And that's where I think churches can start, because we have a lot of influence over spaces. That's where we can start, and all of us can start, with our homes, our families, our sports teams, our schools. In the book, there's how in congregations, and how in schools, and how in sports can we change our racial geography.
On behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you to Jim and to Janice for getting us to talk, to begin calling things out, have conversations, and tell stories.